The capture of Jerusalem by the Frankish armies marked the achievement of the First Crusade's primary objective. However, for the Holy City to stay under Christian control and to ensure an easier journey for pilgrims, it was essential to establish a stable government, secure defenses, and reliable communication lines with Europe. The Crusaders who intended to remain in the East clearly understood these requirements. During the short rule of Duke Godfrey, the foundations of a Christian kingdom were laid. Yet, despite his admirable traits, Godfrey was a weak and naive man. He clashed with his fellow leaders out of jealousy, and his deep religious devotion led him to hand over too much authority to the church. It was only after his death, when his brother Baldwin succeeded him, that the fragile kingdom found new strength. Baldwin had the intelligence, vision, and resilience needed in a true statesman. Still, the challenges he faced were immense, and he had few trustworthy allies. Most of the prominent leaders of the First Crusade had either moved north or returned home. Of the original key figures, only Peter the Hermit remained in Palestine, though little is known about his activities there, and he eventually returned to Europe in 1101. The princes had taken their armies with them. Baldwin, as a younger son without land, had not brought his own vassals to the east but had instead relied on men loaned by his brothers. Now his support came mainly from a small group of devout knights who had pledged to stay in the Holy Land and from a number of adventurers, many also younger sons, who came seeking land and fortune. When Baldwin ascended to the throne, the Franks held a fragile grip over much of Palestine. Their control was most secure along the central highlands of the region, stretching from Bethlehem north to the Jezreel Valley. Many villages in this area had long been Christian, and most of the local Muslim population had fled when the Frankish forces arrived, even abandoning Nablus, their beloved little Damascus. This region was relatively easy to defend. To the east, the Jordan Valley acted as a natural barrier. Between Jericho and Beisan, there was no ford across the river, and only one path led from the valley into the mountains. Access from the west was also limited and difficult. Further north lay the Principality of Galilee, which Tancred had taken for Christendom. It encompassed the Esdraelon plain and the hills stretching from Nazareth to Lake Hula. However, Galilee's borders were more exposed, with entry points from the Mediterranean coast near Acre and from the east via roads running north and south of the Sea of Galilee. Despite these vulnerabilities, most of the Muslim inhabitants had also left, leaving primarily Christians, with a few small Jewish communities remaining in the towns, especially in Safed, a long-standing center of Talmudic learning. After the massacres of Jews in Jerusalem and Tiberias, and their resistance against the Christians in Haifa, many Jews chose exile alongside the Muslims. The Central Ridge in Galilee formed the heart of the Crusader kingdom, but its influence was beginning to extend into surrounding Muslim regions. Galilee had recently secured a coastal link through the port of Haifa. In the south, the Negev region was under watch from the Frankish garrison stationed at Hebron, in a stronghold they called the Castle of St. Abraham. However, this fortress stood isolated in a largely Muslim-controlled area. The Franks had no command over the caravan routes from Arabia, which curved around the southern end of the Dead Sea and followed the ancient Byzantine spice road. These paths allowed Bedouin tribes to move into the Negev and connect with Egyptian forces stationed at Gaza and Ascalon on the Mediterranean. Jerusalem was linked to the coast via a narrow corridor running through Ramla and Lydda to the port of Jaffa. Yet this route was dangerous, used safely only by military escorts. Raiding bands from Egyptian-held cities, displaced Muslims from the highlands, and Bedouin nomads roamed the countryside, lying in ambush for unsuspecting travelers. The Norse pilgrim Ceolwulf, who made the journey to Jerusalem in 1102 after Baldwin had fortified the kingdom, was appalled by the hazards he encountered. Between Jaffa and Haifa were the Muslim-held cities of Arsuf and Caesarea. Though their emirs had pledged allegiance to Godfrey, they continued to maintain contact with Egypt by sea. North of Haifa, the entire coastline remained in Muslim hands for nearly 200 miles, up to the area around Latakia, where the Countess of Toulouse was living with her husband's household under the protection of the Byzantine governor. Palestine was a land of limited wealth. Its prosperity during Roman times had faded after the Persian invasions, and the ongoing conflicts following the arrival of the Turks had disrupted the modest recovery it had seen under the caliphs. The region had more forest cover than it does today. Despite damage caused by the Persians and the gradual clearing by both farmers and goats, significant forests still remained in Galilee, around Mount Carmel, near Samaria, and in a coastal pine forest south of Caesarea. These forests helped retain moisture in a land that naturally lacked water. Grain grew well in the Esdraelon plain, and the warm Jordan Valley produced bananas and other tropical fruits. Were it not for the recent wars, the coastal plains, with their farms, gardens, and bitter orange groves, might have prospered. Many mountain villages were also surrounded by olive trees and fruit orchards. Still, much of the land was dry, with thin and poor soil, especially around Jerusalem. None of the towns had large-scale industry. Even at its peak, the kingdom's monarchs were never as wealthy as the counts of Tripoli or the princes of Antioch. The kingdom's primary income came from tolls. The fertile regions beyond the Jordan, Moab and the Jolon, naturally relied on Palestinian ports for trade. Goods traveling between Syria and Egypt passed along roads through Palestine, and for centuries caravans carrying spices from southern Arabia had crossed the Negev on their way to the Mediterranean. To secure this income, it was essential to close off all alternative trade routes. The Franks would need to control the entire frontier, stretching from the Gulf of Aqaba to Mount Hermon, and even from Lebanon to the Euphrates. Palestine also had a reputation for being unhealthy. Jerusalem, thanks to its elevation and Roman-built sanitation, generally had a healthy climate, except during the Khamsin, the hot, dusty southern wind. However, the warmer plains, though fertile and attractive to invaders, were breeding grounds for disease due to stagnant waters, mosquitoes, and flies. Illnesses like malaria, typhoid, and dysentery were widespread. Outbreaks of cholera and plague spread quickly through overcrowded, unsanitary villages, and leprosy was common. Western knights and soldiers were especially vulnerable, with their heavy clothing, rich diets, and lack of personal hygiene. Their children, particularly their sons, suffered high mortality rates. Nature's harsh irony, making baby girls hardier than boys, would in time create lasting political challenges for the Frankish kingdom. As settlers gradually adopted local customs, their chances of survival improved, but infant mortality remained high. It soon became clear that to maintain a population strong enough to control the region, the kingdom would need a steady and substantial flow of immigrants from Europe. King Baldwin's top priority was to reinforce his realm's defenses, a task that required taking the initiative. He needed to capture Arsuf and Caesarea and incorporate their lands. To secure the coastal route from Jerusalem, Ascalon, lost in 1099 due to Godfrey's rivalry with Count Raymond, had to be reclaimed and the Egyptian border pushed south. Forward posts should be set up in Transjordan and below the Dead Sea. Baldwin also needed to forge links with the Christian principalities to the north, opening safe passage for pilgrims and new settlers. He must press his own advance along the coast and encourage the emergence of further Christian states in Syria. Crucially, he had to obtain a reliable deep-water port. Jaffa's shallow roadstead forced pilgrims to land in small, hazardous boats, and even ships at anchor were at risk in any wind. Haifa's harbor, though deeper and sheltered from southern and western gales by Mount Carmel, was perilous when the north wind blew. Only Acre offered a secure harbor in all conditions, making its capture vital both strategically and commercially. On the domestic front, Baldwin's most pressing needs were men and money. Expanding his army depended on attracting immigrants and winning over the native Christian population. Financial support would come from boosting trade with neighboring lands and tapping into the piety of European believers, whose donations and endowments funded institutions in the Holy Land. Because these gifts typically favored the church, Baldwin needed to assert his authority over ecclesiastical affairs to ensure that such resources served the interests of the entire kingdom. The greatest advantage the Franks possessed was the deep division within the Muslim world. It was largely due to the rivalries and unwillingness of Muslim leaders to unite that the First Crusade had succeeded. The Shia Muslims, led by the Fatimid Caliph of Egypt, despised the Sunni Turks and the Caliph of Baghdad just as much as they hated the Christians. Among the Turks themselves, there was ongoing competition, between the Seljuks and the Danishmends, the Ortakids and the House of Tutush, and even between Tutush's own sons. The ambitions of individual Atabegs like Kerboga only added to the turmoil, while smaller Arab dynasties such as the Banu Ammar of Tripoli and the Munkadites of Shazer took advantage of the chaos to preserve their fragile independence. The success of the Crusaders only deepened this disarray, as disappointment and blame among the Muslim princes made unity even more elusive. The Christians had skillfully exploited Islam's weakness. In the north, the Byzantine Empire, guided by the strategic brilliance of Emperor Alexius, used the Crusade to regain control over Western Asia Minor. The Byzantine navy had recently reasserted dominance along the peninsula's coastline, and with support from Raymond of Toulouse, even the Syrian port of Latakia had returned to imperial hands. The Armenian principalities in the Taurus and Anti-Taurus mountains, once threatened with destruction by the Turks, could now hope for survival. The Crusade also led to the creation of two Frankish principalities that drove a wedge into the Muslim world. Of these, the wealthier and more stable was the Principality of Antioch, established by the Norman Bohemond, despite resistance from his fellow Crusader Raymond of Toulouse and his own pledged allegiance to Emperor Alexius. Though small in territory, comprising the lower Orontes Valley, the plain of Antioch, the Amanus Mountains, and the ports of Alexandretta and St. Simeon, Antioch itself was a prosperous city. Its workshops produced silk, carpets, glass, pottery, and soap. Trade caravans from Aleppo and Mesopotamia continued to pass through, largely ignoring the conflict between Muslims and Christians. The principality's population was almost entirely Christian, including Greeks and Orthodox Syrians, Syrian Jacobites, a few Nestorians, and Armenians. Their mutual distrust made them easy for the Normans to govern. The main external threat came not from Muslim neighbors, but from the Byzantine Empire. The emperor believed he had been wronged over Antioch's control, and with the Cilician ports and Latakia under his authority and a fleet based in Cyprus, he was waiting for a chance to reassert his claim. The local Orthodox Christians hoped for a return to Byzantine rule, but the Normans were able to balance them by aligning with the Armenians and Jacobites. Antioch suffered a serious setback in the summer of 1100 when Bohemond led a campaign to the upper Euphrates. His army was defeated by the Danishmend emir, and he was taken prisoner. Despite the loss of manpower, the principality was not permanently damaged. King Baldwin, then still Count of Edessa, acted swiftly to prevent the Turks from exploiting their victory. A few months later, Tancred arrived from Palestine to serve as regent during his uncle's captivity. In Tancred, the Normans found a bold and determined leader, as ambitious and ruthless as Bohemond himself. The Second Frankish state, the County of Edessa, acted as a protective buffer for Antioch against Muslim attacks. Now governed by Baldwin of Lubourg, cousin and namesake of King Baldwin, the county covered a larger area than the Principality of Antioch. It extended across both sides of the Euphrates, from Ravendell and Aintab to an ill-defined border in the Jazira region, east of Edessa itself. The territory had no clear natural boundaries and lacked a unified population. Although Christians, primarily Syrian Jacobites and Armenians, formed the majority, Muslim towns such as Saraj were also part of the region. The Franks could not hope to establish a centralized administration here. Instead, they maintained control by manning key fortresses, from which they collected taxes and tribute from nearby villages and launched profitable raids across the border. This region had long been a frontier zone, marked by constant conflict. Yet it contained fertile lands and several thriving towns. Through a combination of taxation and raiding, the Count of Edessa was able to generate sufficient income. Baldwin I, in fact, was financially better off as Count of Edessa than he later would be as King of Jerusalem. What both Antioch and Edessa needed most was manpower, though not to the same extent as Jerusalem. In Palestine, the local Christian population had been banned from bearing arms since the early Muslim conquests, leaving the new rulers without reliable native troops. In contrast, Antioch and Edessa lay within former Byzantine borders, where there were Christian communities, particularly Armenians, with a strong military tradition. If the Armenians could be brought into cooperation with the Frankish leadership, they would provide a ready-made fighting force. Initially, both Bohemond and Tancred in Antioch, as well as Baldwin I and Baldwin II in Edessa, attempted to win over the Armenians. However, they ultimately proved untrustworthy and disloyal, and could not be entrusted with positions of authority. As a result, the rulers of both states relied on Western-born knights to lead their troops and hold their castles, and on Western-born clergy to manage governance. While Antioch presented new settlers with a relatively secure and stable life, Edessa could only appeal to bold adventurers willing to live like warrior chiefs on a rugged and dangerous frontier. Jerusalem was separated from the two northern Frankish states by a long stretch of territory controlled by numerous rival Muslim rulers. The coastal area directly north of the kingdom was dominated by four wealthy seaports: Acre, Tyre, Sidon, and Beirut. Each of these ports nominally owed allegiance to Egypt, though their loyalty fluctuated depending on the presence and influence of the Egyptian fleet. Further north lay the emirate of the Banu Ammar, centered in Tripoli. The emir had recently taken advantage of the Crusaders' departure to the south to expand his territory as far as Tortosa. The town of Jabala, located between Tortosa and Latakia, was initially controlled by a local leader, Qadi ibn Salihah, who in the summer of 1101 surrendered it to Tugdukan, Atabeg to Dukak of Damascus. The town later came under the rule of the Banu Ammar. In the Nozeri Mountains behind Tortosa and Jabala were the small emirates of the Banu Muris, who held Markab and Cadmus, and the Banu Amran, who controlled Kaf. The upper Orontes Valley was fragmented among several powers. These included Caliph Ibn Mulaybi of Apamea, a Shiite loyal to the Fatimid Caliphate, the Munkadhite family of Shazer, the most prominent of the smaller dynasties, and Jana ad-Dawla of Homs, a former Atabeg to Ridwan of Aleppo who had broken with his master and gained near independence. Aleppo itself remained under Ridwan's rule. As a member of the Seljuk dynasty, he held the title of Malik, or king. To the east, the Jazira region was mostly controlled by the Ortakid family, who had withdrawn there after the Fatimids retook Jerusalem in 1097. These Ortakids were regarded as vassals of Dukak of Damascus, who also bore the title Malik and governed from the capital. The political instability of the region was intensified by its complex and diverse population. The Turks formed a scattered feudal aristocracy, while most of the smaller emirs were Arabs. In northern Syria and around Damascus, many of the towns were inhabited by Christians, including Jacobite Syrians, Nestorians in the eastern areas, and Armenians who were gradually moving in from the north. The lands controlled by the Banu Ammar were heavily populated by Maronites, a monothelite Christian sect. In the Nozeri Mountains lived the Nozeris, a Shiite sect that provided strong backing for Caliph Ibn Mulaybi. Along the slopes of southern Lebanon, the Druze, also Shiites who believed in the divinity of the Caliph al-Hakim, resided. They despised their Muslim neighbors but harbored even greater hatred toward Christians. The situation was further complicated by continuous migrations. Arabs from the desert and Kurds from the northern mountains were steadily moving into the cultivated areas, while roaming bands of Turkoman mercenaries offered their services to whichever warlord could pay them. Among Syria's Muslim neighbors, the most powerful were the Fatimid rulers of Egypt. The Nile Valley and Delta formed one of the most densely populated regions in the medieval world. Cairo and Alexandria stood out as major industrial centers, where workshops produced goods like glass, pottery, metalwork, fine linens, and brocades. The fertile land yielded vast amounts of grain, and the delta was home to extensive sugar plantations. Egypt also controlled trade routes to the Sudan, supplying valuable resources such as gold, gum arabic, ostrich feathers, and ivory. Trade from the Far East now traveled through the Red Sea, making Egyptian ports the gateway to the Mediterranean. The Egyptian state had the capacity to field large armies. Although native Egyptian soldiers were not held in high regard for their combat skills, the government had ample resources to hire large numbers of mercenaries. In addition, Egypt was unique among Muslim powers in possessing a significant naval fleet. As a Shia leader, the Fatimid Caliph naturally assumed the role of protector for Syria's Shia communities. However, his rule was known for its tolerance, and many Sunni Arabs, concerned about Turkish dominance, were also willing to accept his authority. Although Turkish incursions had reduced Fatimid control over Syria, and the Crusaders' capture of Jerusalem followed by their victory over the Egyptian army at Ascalon had damaged their standing, Egypt was strong enough to absorb such losses. It was evident that Vizier al-Afdal, the de facto ruler of Egypt on behalf of the young Caliph al-Amir, intended to retaliate and reclaim Palestine. Al-Afdal, an Armenian born in Acre, remained determined to restore Fatimid power. Meanwhile, the Egyptian fleet maintained communication with the Muslim coastal cities. The rival Abbasid Caliph, al-Mustazir, based in Baghdad, was a figurehead, young and politically weak, his reign dependent on the authority of the Seljuk Sultan. However, the Sultan Barkirak, eldest son of the renowned Malik Shah, lacked his father's strength and leadership. He was constantly challenged by his brothers. One of them, Sanjar, had to be granted control over Khorasan, and from 1099 onward, Barkirak was engaged in conflict with another brother, Muhammad, who eventually seized Iraq. These internal struggles left Barkirak unable to offer meaningful support in the fight against the Crusaders. The leader of the youngest branch of the Seljuk dynasty, Kilij Arslan of Anatolia, who referred to himself as Sultan, was, at the time, in a weak position much like that of his cousin. The First Crusade had cost him his capital, Nicaea, along with most of his wealth, lost during the battle at Dorylaeum. A significant portion of his former territory had been reclaimed by the Byzantine Empire. He was also in conflict with the Eastern Seljuks, as he refused to acknowledge their authority. Despite these setbacks, Kilij Arslan was able to begin rebuilding his strength, thanks to the influx of Turkoman migrants into Anatolia. These newcomers provided him with a renewed army and a growing population that increasingly displaced the region's Christians. Even more effective was the Danish Mende Emirate, based securely in Shivas and holding dominance over northeastern Anatolia. Its leader Gumustikin had recently gained fame by capturing Bohemond, becoming the first Muslim commander to defeat a force of Frankish knights. Like Kilij Arslan, he too benefited from the steady flow of Turkoman immigrants, which bolstered his power. Lying between the Turkish-controlled areas of Anatolia and the Frankish states of northern Syria were a series of Armenian principalities. Ashan ruled the central Taurus Mountains, while to his east lay the territories governed by the princes of the Rapinian family. In the anti-Taurus Mountains was Kök Vasil, while Thatil controlled Marash and Gabriel ruled over Melitene. Thatil and Gabriel belonged to the Orthodox Church, making them more inclined to cooperate with the Byzantine Empire. Along with Ashan, they derived their legitimacy from imperial titles granted by the Byzantine emperor. In contrast, the Rapinians, who were the only Armenian dynasty among them to establish a lasting state, held deep-rooted hostility toward both Byzantium and the Orthodox Church. The external Christian power most deeply involved in Syrian affairs was the Byzantine Empire. Emperor Alexius had ruled for nearly 20 years. When he came to power, the empire was at its lowest point, but through skillful diplomacy, careful financial management, and a shrewd approach to both allies and enemies, he restored it to a position of stability. He had leveraged the momentum of the Crusades to reclaim Western Asia Minor from Turkish control, and his reorganized navy gave Byzantium dominance over the coastal regions. Even during its weakest periods, Byzantium retained immense prestige throughout the East. It was still considered the Roman Empire, carrying the weight of 1,000 years of history, and its emperor was recognized, whether grudgingly or not, as the head of Christendom. Constantinople, with its bustling population, enormous wealth, and formidable defenses, remained the most awe-inspiring city of its time. The empire's military forces were the best equipped of the age, and its currency, the imperial hyperpyron, also known as the bezant or solidus, had long served as the standard for international exchange, its value originally fixed by Constantine the Great. Although Byzantium would continue to play a major role in the politics of the East for nearly a century, its influence was based more on the brilliance of its diplomacy and the enduring authority of its Roman legacy than on actual military or economic strength. The Turkish invasions had shattered the social and economic structure of Anatolia, which had traditionally supplied the empire with most of its soldiers and agricultural goods. While some territories had been recovered, reviving their former organization was nearly impossible. By this time, the Byzantine army was almost entirely made up of mercenaries, costly and not always dependable. Turkish mercenary forces like the Pecheneg could be deployed safely against the Franks or Slavs, but they were untrustworthy in conflicts against fellow Turks. Frankish mercenaries, on the other hand, were reluctant to fight against their own countrymen. Early in his reign, Alexius had been forced to secure Venetian naval assistance by granting the Venetians commercial privileges, which harmed his own merchants. Similar concessions later had to be made to other maritime powers, such as Genoa and Pisa. As a result, Byzantine trade began slipping into foreign hands. In a further effort to raise funds, Alexius eventually debased the currency, issuing gold coins with less gold content than required. This undermined trust in the bezant. Soon, many of the empire's trading partners demanded to be paid only in michels, coins minted under Emperor Michael VII, the last currency still considered reliable. The emperor's primary concern was the well-being of his own empire. He had initially welcomed the First Crusade and was willing to work with its leaders. However, Bohemond's ambition and betrayal at Antioch had deeply shocked and angered him. His foremost objective became the recovery of Antioch and securing control over the routes leading to it through Asia Minor. Once the Crusaders advanced into Palestine, his direct cooperation came to an end. For the past century, the traditional policy of Byzantium had been to align with the Fatimid Caliphate of Egypt against the Sunni Abbasids and the Turks. With the exception of the reign of the erratic Caliph Hakim, the Fatimids had generally treated Eastern Christians with tolerance. Alexius had no reason to believe that Frankish rule would be any better for them. As a result, he distanced himself from the Crusaders' campaign toward Jerusalem. Yet, as the protector of the Orthodox faith, he could not ignore what might happen to Jerusalem. If the Frankish kingdom in the Holy Land appeared likely to endure, he would need to ensure that his imperial rights were acknowledged. He was prepared to show goodwill toward the Franks in Palestine, but any active assistance would be limited to aiding the reopening of routes across Asia Minor. Toward the Normans in Antioch, however, he held only hostility and would prove to be a formidable adversary. He showed no particular interest in reclaiming Edessa, likely recognizing the usefulness of the Frankish county there as a buffer zone against Muslim powers. A new element had also emerged in the politics of the East, the involvement of the Italian merchant republics. Initially hesitant to join the crusade, they became eager participants once its success seemed assured. Pisa, Venice, and Genoa all dispatched fleets to the region, offering their naval support in exchange for commercial privileges and settlements in any city they helped conquer. The Crusaders welcomed this support, as they lacked the sea power necessary to capture Muslim-held coastal cities and needed reliable maritime routes to Europe, which were faster and safer than overland travel. However, the price of this help was high. The concessions granted to the Italian cities significantly reduced the potential income that the Frankish rulers in the east could collect from their own territories. The complicated international situation offered King Baldwin little reason for hope. His allies were either unreliable or driven by greed, more focused on their own interests than on any shared cause. The internal divisions among his enemies were advantageous for the moment, but should the Muslim world unite under a capable leader, the survival of the Frankish states in the east would be in serious jeopardy. Meanwhile, Baldwin faced these challenges with very limited support, in a harsh and unhealthy land that had served as a battleground for empires throughout history. It was therefore with some relief and eager anticipation that he received news of new crusading expeditions departing from the west. The news that the Christians had recaptured Jerusalem reached Western Europe in the late summer of 1099, and it was met with widespread celebration and joy. Chroniclers across the continent paused their accounts of local affairs to record what they saw as a powerful sign of God's mercy. Although Pope Urban had died before receiving the news, his allies and supporters throughout the church praised God for what they considered the triumph of his vision. Throughout the following winter, many crusade leaders returned home with their men. As returning soldiers often do, they likely exaggerated both the hardships they had endured and the wonders of the lands they had visited. They spoke at length about the miracles that had guided them, and they all emphasized the urgent need for more warriors and settlers in the East to continue God's mission. They claimed that great wealth and vast estates awaited the brave, and they encouraged others to take up the cross. The preachers of the church gave their blessing to this renewed call for action. However, it was not until the early autumn of 1100 that the next expedition could depart. Winter travel was impractical, and the harvest had to be completed first. In September 1100, a crusading army from Lombardy set out for the east. It was led by one of the most prominent figures in the region, Anselm of Buis, the Archbishop of Milan. Among those accompanying him were Albert, Count of Biandrate, Count Guibert of Parma, and Hugh of Montebello. The Lombards had played a rather unremarkable role in the First Crusade. Many had joined early on under Peter the Hermit, and by aligning with his German followers against the French, they contributed to the failure of his expedition. Those who survived later entered Bohemond's service. As a result, Bohemond held the greatest esteem among crusade leaders in Lombardy. Unfortunately, this new expedition was not much better organized. It included very few trained fighters and consisted mostly of an undisciplined crowd drawn from the poorer districts of Lombard cities, people whose lives had been disrupted by the region's growing industrialization. The group also included large numbers of clergy, women, and children. Although the force was sizable, the estimate of 200,000 participants given by Albert of Aix is likely an exaggeration by at least a factor of 10. Neither the Archbishop nor Count Biandrate, considered the military commander, was able to maintain order among the unruly masses. In the autumn of 1100, the Lombard Crusaders began their slow journey across Carniola, following the valley of the Save River through the lands of the King of Hungary, eventually entering the Byzantine Empire at Belgrade. Emperor Alexius was prepared for their arrival. His troops escorted them safely across the Balkans. However, since the Lombards were too numerous to house and manage in a single location, they were divided into three groups. One group was stationed outside Philippopolis for the winter, another near Adrianople, and the third near Rodosto. Despite this arrangement, their large numbers and lack of discipline proved difficult to control. Each contingent began to loot the surrounding countryside, raiding villages, breaking into grain stores, and even robbing churches. Eventually, in March, the emperor gathered them all at a camp outside the walls of Constantinople, intending to send them across to Asia as soon as possible. However, the Lombards had heard that additional crusaders were on their way to join them and refused to cross the Bosphorus until the reinforcements arrived. To compel them to move, imperial officials cut off their supplies. In response, the Lombards attacked the city walls and broke into the courtyard of the Blacherni Palace. There, they killed one of the emperor's prized lions and attempted to force open the palace gates. The Archbishop of Milan and Count Byzantine, both of whom had been treated graciously by the emperor, were appalled. They rushed into the chaos and, after considerable effort, managed to calm the crowds and lead them back to their camp. Then, they were faced with the challenge of soothing the emperor's anger. It was Count Raymond of Toulouse who ultimately restored peace. He had spent the winter as a guest of Alexius and had earned the emperor's full trust. As the most senior of the crusading princes and a respected ally of both Pope Urban and Bishop Adhemer, Raymond still held great influence. The Lombards listened to his counsel and agreed to cross into Asia. By the end of April, they had set up camp near Nicomedia, awaiting the arrival of more crusaders from the west. Stephen, Count of Blois, had long been haunted by the shame of his retreat from Antioch. He had failed to fulfill his Crusader vows and had shown cowardice in the face of the enemy. His wife, Countess Adela, daughter of William the Conqueror, was deeply embarrassed by his actions. Even in their private moments, she would scold him, urging him to reclaim his honor. Stephen couldn't even argue that he was needed at home, as Adela had always been the real authority in their lands. So, reluctantly and full of unease, he set out once more for the Holy Land in the spring of 1101. The news of his departure inspired many French knights to join him. Among them were Stephen, Count of Burgundy, Hugh of Blois, Baldwin of Grandpré, and the Bishop of Soissons, Hugh of Pierrefonds. Traveling south through Italy and across the Adriatic Sea, they reached Constantinople around early May. Along the way, they were joined by a small German force under Conrad, constable to Emperor Henry IV. The French Crusaders were pleased to find Raymond already in Constantinople, and they were satisfied with the welcome they received from Emperor Alexius. Likely at the emperor's suggestion, they agreed that Raymond should command the entire expedition, and the Lombards accepted this arrangement. In the final days of May, the combined army, French, Germans, Lombards, and a contingent of Byzantine troops under the General Tsaitas, accompanied by 500 Turkish mercenaries, likely Pechenegs, set out from Nicomedia, heading toward Dorylaeum. The mission of the crusade was to reach the Holy Land, while also reopening the overland route through Asia Minor, a goal the emperor fully supported. Stephen of Blois proposed that they follow the same path taken by the First Crusade, through Dorylaeum and Konya. Raymond, following Alexius's instructions, agreed. But the Lombards, who made up the bulk of the army, had different ideas. Their loyalty lay with Bohemond, whom they saw as the true hero capable of leading them to victory. Bohemond was still being held prisoner in the Danishmend emir's castle at Niksar, far to the northeast of Anatolia. The Lombards insisted that rescuing Bohemond must be their first objective. Raymond and Stephen tried to argue against it, but without success. Raymond's known rivalry with Bohemond weakened his position, and despite his many qualities, he lacked the forcefulness to impose his will. Stephen's influence was undermined by the memory of his earlier cowardice. The Count of Byzantine and the Archbishop of Milan backed the Lombards, and their will prevailed. After leaving Nicomedia, the army turned east and took the road toward Ankara. Much of the land along their route was still under Byzantine control, allowing them to find provisions as they marched. When they arrived at Ankara on June 23, they found the city, now held by the Seljuk Sultan Kilij Arslan, poorly defended. The Crusaders captured it by storm and dutifully handed it over to the emperor's representatives. After departing from Ankara, the Crusaders took a route heading northeast toward Gangra, located in southern Paphlagonia, where they planned to connect with the main road leading to Amasya and Niksar. But trouble soon began. Kilij Arslan, retreating ahead of them, devastated the countryside, leaving little food behind.
At the same time, the Danishmend emir, Malik Ghazi, grew alarmed by the Crusader advance.
He renewed his alliance with Kilij Arslan and persuaded Ridwan of Aleppo to send reinforcements from the south. By early July, the Crusaders reached Gangra, only to find it heavily defended by Seljuk forces. The fortress was too strong to capture. After plundering the surrounding area for supplies, the Crusaders were forced to move on. Weakened by hunger and exhaustion, they also struggled with the intense July heat on the Anatolian plateau. In their desperation, they turned to Count Raymond, who proposed heading north to Kastamuni and then on to a Byzantine-held city on the Black Sea coast. This route, he argued, would save the army from certain destruction. Raymond also likely hoped that if he returned to the emperor after reclaiming two key fortresses, Ankara and Kastamuni, he would be forgiven for his earlier disobedience. Kastamuni, after all, was the famed Castra Komnenon, once the seat of the imperial family. The journey to Kastamoni proved slow and grueling. The Turks had destroyed wells and crops, and water was scarce. Meanwhile, Turkish forces shadowed them along parallel paths, striking at the front or rear as opportunity allowed. Not long into the journey, the vanguard, made up of 700 Lombards, was suddenly attacked. The Lombard knights fled in panic, abandoning their infantry, who were massacred. It took great effort from Stephen of Burgundy to rally the remaining troops and repel the attackers. In the days that followed, Raymond, commanding the rear, fought off constant Turkish assaults. Eventually, the Crusaders were forced to march in a tight formation, unable to send out scouts or foraging parties. By the time they neared Kastamoni, the leaders realized their only hope for survival was to break through directly to the Black Sea coast. However, the Lombards refused to listen. Perhaps they blamed Raymond for choosing the Kastamoni route, or maybe they believed that entering Danishmend territory would ease their difficulties. Either way, in their stubbornness, they insisted on heading east again. The other commanders had no choice but to go along. Their smaller groups could not hope to survive on their own. The crusading army crossed the Halys River and entered the Danishmend emir's territory. Along the way, they sacked a Christian village. Soon after, they arrived at Mersavan, located halfway between the Halys and Amasya. There, Constable Conrad was caught in an ambush and lost several hundred of his German soldiers. It became clear that the Danishmends and their allies were preparing for a serious confrontation. Raymond organized the Crusader forces and readied them for battle. As the battle began, the Turks used their usual strategy. Mounted archers would charge in, unleash volleys of arrows, and then quickly withdraw, only to be replaced by others attacking from different directions. The Crusaders were never allowed to engage in close combat, where their superior strength and better weapons might have given them the upper hand. It wasn't long before the Lombards began to panic. Led by the Count of Edessa, they fled the battlefield in terror, abandoning their priests and women. The Pecheneg mercenaries, seeing no point in staying to die, quickly followed suit. Raymond, who was fighting alongside them, suddenly found himself alone. He managed to retreat with his bodyguard to a small rocky hill, where he held his position until Stephen of Blois and Stephen of Burgundy arrived to rescue him. Throughout the afternoon, the French knights and the German contingent under Conrad fought with determination, retreating gradually toward the camp. But by nightfall, Raymond had had enough. Under cover of darkness, he escaped with his Provençal guard and a Byzantine escort, heading toward the coast. When news of his flight reached the other leaders, they lost hope and abandoned the fight. By dawn, the remnants of the army were in full retreat, leaving their camp, and those unable to flee, at the mercy of the Turks. The Turks stopped briefly to massacre the remaining men and elderly women in the camp, then resumed their pursuit.
Only the mounted knight managed to escape.
Nearly all the infantry were overtaken and killed. The Lombards, whose stubbornness had led to the disaster, were virtually wiped out, save for a few of their leaders. It was estimated that 4/5 of the entire army was lost. The Turks seized a massive cache of weapons and treasures, while the younger women and children were taken into captivity and sold into slavery across the east. Raymond and his escort reached the small Byzantine port of Bafra, located at the mouth of the Halys River. There, they found a ship to carry them back to Constantinople. The other surviving knights fought their way across the river and made it to the coast at Sinope. From there, they slowly followed the coastal road through Byzantine territory, eventually reaching the Bosphorus. By early autumn, they had all regrouped in Constantinople. Among the Crusaders, public opinion quickly looked for someone to blame for the disaster, and many pointed fingers at the Byzantines. Rumors spread that Count Raymond had followed the emperor's orders when he led the army off course, straight into a Turkish ambush that had been arranged in advance. But in reality, Alexius was outraged with Raymond and the other leaders. Though he received them with formal courtesy, his displeasure was clear. Had the Crusade succeeded in capturing Kastamoni and the interior of Paphlagonia for him, Alexius might have overlooked their actions. But his true priorities lay elsewhere. He wanted to secure the main road to Syria, protect his reconquered territories in the southwestern part of Asia Minor, and maintain the ability to intervene in Syrian affairs. He also had no desire to be drawn into a conflict with the Danishmend emir, with whom he had begun negotiating for Bohemond's release. The reckless behavior of the Lombards had destroyed that plan. The consequences of the defeat were far-reaching. The First Crusade had shaken Turkish morale and damaged their confidence. Now, that damage was reversed. The Seljuk Sultan regained control over central Anatolia and soon made Konya his capital, right along the vital route from Constantinople to Syria. Meanwhile, Malik Ghazi of the Danishmends expanded his territory down the Euphrates Valley, right up to the edges of the County of Edessa. As a result, the land route from Europe to Syria was once again closed off, not just for the Crusaders, but also for the Byzantines. Relations between the Crusaders and Byzantium grew even worse. The Crusaders blamed the emperor for their misfortunes, while the Byzantines were disgusted by what they saw as the Crusaders' foolishness, ingratitude, and dishonesty. The consequences of the earlier disaster quickly became evident. Just a few days after the Lombards had left Nicomedia, a French army led by William II, Count of Nevers, arrived in Constantinople. He had departed from his homeland in February, crossed Italy, and sailed from Brindisi to Avlona across the Adriatic. His army made a strong impression as it marched through Macedonia, thanks to its strict discipline. Count William was warmly welcomed by Emperor Alexius, but chose not to stay in Constantinople. He had likely expected to meet the Duke of Burgundy there, his neighbor back in France, and hurried on in hopes of catching up to him. When William reached Nicomedia, he found out that the crusade had already moved on to Ankara. He continued in that direction and arrived there toward the end of July, only to discover that no one knew where the Franco-Lombard army had gone. With no other choice, he turned back and took the road toward Konya. Despite the difficulties of traveling through a region still devastated from the First Crusade, his army maintained its order. Konya was now defended by a strong Seljuk garrison, and William's attempt to capture it by assault failed. Realizing that lingering there would be risky, he continued on his way. However, Kilij Arslan and Malik Ghazi had already learned of this new threat. Fresh from their victory over the Lombards, they rushed southward, probably passing through Caesarea Mazaka and Nigda, and reached Heraclea before William's army. Marching slowly east from Konya, the Nivernais forces faced harsh conditions. Food was scarce, and the Turks had sabotaged the wells along the route. As they approached Heraclea, exhausted and weakened, they were ambushed and surrounded by the combined Turkish forces, which vastly outnumbered them. After a brief struggle, the Crusaders' resistance collapsed. Nearly all the French soldiers were killed on the battlefield, except for Count William and a small group of mounted knights who managed to break through the lines. After several days wandering in the Taurus Mountains, they finally arrived at the Byzantine fortress of Germanicopolis, northwest of Isaurian Seleucia. There, the Byzantine governor reportedly gave them an escort of 12 Pecheneg mercenaries to help guide them to the Syrian border. A few weeks later, Count William and his men reached Antioch, half-naked and unarmed. They claimed that the Pechenegs had robbed them and left them stranded in the desert, though what truly happened remains unclear. The Count of Nevers had barely crossed the Bosphorus when another much larger army arrived in Constantinople, made up of both French and German troops. The French forces were led by William IX, Duke of Aquitaine, renowned as the most famous troubadour of his era. He was also a political rival of Raymond of Toulouse, since his wife, Duchess Philippa, was the daughter of Raymond's older brother and the rightful heir to the County of Toulouse. Accompanying William was Hugh of Vermandois, who had abandoned the First Crusade after the capture of Antioch and was now eager to fulfill his vow by journeying to Jerusalem. The Aquitanian army had set out from France in March, traveling overland through southern Germany and Hungary. Along the way, they were joined by Duke Welf of Bavaria. After a long and distinguished career in Germany, Welf had decided to spend his later years fighting for the Christian cause in Palestine. He brought with him a well-armed force of German knights and infantry, and was accompanied by Themo, Archbishop of Salzburg, as well as the Dowager Margravine Ida of Austria, considered one of the great beauties of her time, who, now past her youth, sought spiritual purpose and adventure in the Crusade. Together, their combined armies marched down the Danube to Belgrade and continued along the main road across the Balkans. But they were an unruly group, and by the time they reached Adrianople, their behavior had become so disruptive that the Byzantine authorities sent Pecheneg and Palovsian troops to block their advance. A battle broke out, and it was only after Duke William and Duke Welf personally intervened and promised that their troops would behave that they were allowed to continue their journey. A strong imperial escort was assigned to guide them to Constantinople. Once in the capital, William, Welf, and the Margravine were warmly welcomed by Emperor Alexius, who quickly arranged for their troops to be transported across the Bosphorus. Some of the non-combatant pilgrims, including the historian Eckhard of Ora, sailed directly to Palestine, arriving there after a 6-week sea voyage. The two dukes might have been able to catch up with the Count of Nevers and reinforce their strength by joining forces. However, the Count of Nevers preferred to unite with the Count of Burgundy, while Duke William refused to associate with an army led by his longtime rival, the Count of Toulouse. Welf of Bavaria, an adversary of Emperor Henry IV, was also unlikely to want to fight alongside Henry's constable, Conrad. As a result, the Count of Nevers pushed ahead toward Ankara, while the Aquitanian-Bavarian army lingered near the Bosphorus for 5 weeks before slowly advancing along the main route to Dorylaeum and Konya. By the time they reached Dorylaeum, the Nivernais army had already passed through on its way back and was approaching Konya. The recent passage of another Crusader force had only made things worse for the newcomers. What little food had been available was already consumed, and as usual, the Crusaders blamed the Byzantines. Like the Nivernais before them, they found the wells either dry or deliberately blocked. The town of Philomelium was deserted and looted by the Crusaders. The Turkish garrison at Konya, which had held off the earlier army, abandoned the city before the larger force arrived. But before leaving, they stripped the town of all food and emptied the orchards and gardens around it, leaving the Crusaders with almost nothing. Around the same time, about 100 miles ahead, Kilij Arslan and Malik Ghazi were decimating the army of Nevers. The Crusaders pressed on from Konya, parched and starving, across the barren landscape toward Heraclea. Turkish cavalry soon began harassing their flanks, shooting arrows into their ranks and attacking any foragers or stragglers. In early September, the army reached Heraclea, only to find it deserted like Konya. Just beyond the town flowed one of the few rivers in Anatolia that remained full during the summer. Driven half-mad by thirst, the soldiers broke formation and rushed toward the water. But hidden in the nearby thickets were Turkish forces lying in wait. As the Crusaders surged forward in chaos, the Turks attacked from all sides, quickly surrounding them. There was no chance to regroup.
Panique swept through the Christian ranks.
Cavalry and infantry alike were caught in a wild stampede, and many were cut down as they tried to flee. Duke William of Aquitaine, accompanied only by one groom, fought his way out and fled into the mountains. After days of wandering, he eventually made it to Tarsus. Hugh of Vermandois was gravely wounded during the battle, but was rescued by some of his men and also reached Tarsus. However, his wounds proved fatal, and he died on October 18. He was buried in the Cathedral of St. Paul, never having fulfilled his vow to reach Jerusalem. Welf of Bavaria escaped by discarding all his armor and after several weeks, arrived in Antioch with only a few attendants. Archbishop Themo was captured and martyred for his faith. The fate of the Margravine of Austria remains unknown. Later legends claim she became a concubine in a distant harem and gave birth to the Muslim leader Zengi. More likely, she was thrown from her litter during the chaos and trampled to death. Each of the 3 crusades launched in the year 1101 ended in disaster, and their collective failure left a lasting impact on the entire crusading movement. The Turks had avenged their earlier loss at Dorylaeum, proving that they would not be driven out of Anatolia after all. The overland route across the peninsula remained too dangerous for Christian armies, whether Frankish or Byzantine. When the Byzantines later wished to intervene in Syria, they were forced to do so along lengthy and vulnerable supply lines. Meanwhile, Frankish settlers from the west were hesitant to travel overland through Constantinople unless part of a large army. Most could only travel by sea, and few could afford the cost. As a result, instead of thousands of valuable settlers arriving in Syria and Palestine that year, only a small number of bickering leaders made it through, leaders who had already lost their armies and reputations along the way. The Frankish states, already full of internal rivalries, gained little from their arrival. However, not all Christians viewed the setbacks of 1101 with regret. For the Italian maritime cities, the failure to secure the overland route across Asia Minor translated into greater influence and wealth. They owned the ships that became essential for communication and transport between Europe and the Crusader states, and they demanded commercial privileges in return for their cooperation. The Armenians in the Taurus Mountains, especially the Rupenian princes, also benefited from the situation. With Byzantium unable to reassert control over the regions where they lived, their independence was preserved. But Armenians farther east had less reason to rejoice. Their main enemy, the Danishmend emir, emboldened by his victory, soon launched attacks against them. The Normans at Antioch, like the Rupenians, feared Byzantine interference more than Turkish attacks. For them, the setbacks of 1101 brought a much-needed reprieve. Though Bohemond remained in captivity, his regent Tancred took full advantage of the chaos to strengthen the principality, often at the emperor's expense. Fate soon handed him an unexpected advantage. By autumn 1101, the Duke of Aquitaine, the Count of Bavaria, and the Count of Nevers had all arrived in Antioch with a few survivors of their armies. But the leaders of the Franco-Lombard Crusade were still in Constantinople. Emperor Alexius found it difficult to forgive their failures, even Raymond, on whom he had once pinned high hopes. At the year's end, the Western princes resolved to continue their pilgrimage. Raymond asked permission to rejoin his wife and his troops at Latakia. The emperor agreed and provided ships to carry them to Syria. Around the new year, Stephen of Blois, Stephen of Burgundy, Constable Conrad, and Albert of Biandrate landed at St. Simeon and hurried to Antioch, where Tancred received them warmly. Raymond, however, was not so fortunate. His ship had been separated from the others and docked at the port of Tarsus. As he came ashore, a knight named Bernard the Stranger confronted and arrested him, accusing him of betraying Christendom by fleeing the battlefield at Mercevin. Raymond's small group of guards was unable to defend him. He was taken into custody and handed over to Tancred.